Imagine you've been handed this highly specialized mission.
Okay.
You are tasked with communicating the entire macroeconomic and social trajectory of a nation. So its past, its incredibly precarious present, and its high-stakes future.
Right.
But there is a massive catch.
Which is?
You are not allowed to speak a single word.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, you can't stand at a podium to persuade an audience. You can't write a sweeping historical essay. You can only use a minimalist, starkly designed data presentation.
That's incredibly restrictive.
It is. So, how do you tell a gripping, complex story of economic survival, vulnerability, and structural transformation, using only pure white backgrounds, severe navy blue charts, and, single, very deliberate drops of warning red?
It genuinely sounds like a psychological experiment disguised as an academic design challenge.
Right.
Because when you strip away the voice, the rhetoric, and the persuasive tone of a human speaker, well, the data has absolutely nowhere to hide. It has to carry the narrative entirely on its own weight.
And that is exactly the mission of today's deep dive. We are unpacking a highly specific, expert-level design brief for an academic presentation. And the subject is the island nation of Curacao.
Which is a fascinating case study.
It really is. Now, when I bring up Curacao, your mind might instantly conjure up, like the tourist brochure version. You picture the pristine Caribbean beaches, the pastel-colored Dutch colonial buildings lining the water in Willemstad.
Maybe the famous blue liqueur.
Exactly, the blue liqueur. But the document we are analyzing today is the absolute antithesis of a tourist brochure.
Oh, absolutely.
It is a rigorous, deeply unsentimental assessment of an economy in the midst of a profound structural transition.
And it's essential to understand why we're focusing on Curacao today. From a macroeconomic perspective, microeconomies, especially geographically isolated island nations, they aren't just quirky outliers.
Right.
They act as perfectly contained laboratories.
Okay, what do you mean by laboratories?
Well, the massive global macro trends that you and I see playing out slowly in large countries like the United States or across the European Union.
Like climate change, things like that?
Yeah, things like rapid demographic aging, the intensely painful transition away from fossil fuels, the devastating impact of external supply chain shocks. Those trends play out in real time and with highly magnified intensity on an island of roughly 150,000 people.
Wow, just 150,000.
Exactly. Everything is concentrated.
So before we get into those numbers, I want to dig into the actual aesthetic instructions of this design brief because they really set the tone for the entire economic analysis.
Your visual rules, yeah.
The rules given to the designer are practically draconian. It explicitly forbids any loud colors, any decorative stock images, and absolutely no 3D graphics.
Not at all.
None. It mandates a pure white background. Specifically, it calls out the hex code FFFFFF and a color system restricted entirely to deep navy blue, neutral gray, and one single accent color.
And that accent color has to be either a warning red or a deep ochre, right?
Yes. And that red is reserved strictly for data inflection points or extreme values. It also demands these little 2D arrows for trends and red or dark fine line circles around key data points.
With little text call-out boxes.
Exactly. Why would an academic committee enforce such a joyless, clinical visual style?
Well, because noise provides a psychological buffer.
A buffer.
Yeah. Think about it. When you look at a poorly designed, cluttered chart in a typical corporate meeting, the drop shadows, the gradient fills, the unnecessary clip art.
Oh yeah, the dreaded 3D pie charts.
Exactly. Your brain is working so hard to parse the visual garbage that it protects you from the intellectual impact of the actual numbers. By enforcing extreme minimalism, this brief removes that buffer.
Oh wow. So you have to look right at the hard truth.
Right. In an academic, speakerless format, the cognitive load on the viewer has to be managed with absolute precision. Navy blue psychologically projects institutional stability and rigorous structure. It tells the viewer this is objective reality.
And the red.
When you introduce a sudden, sharp red circle around a specific data point on a pure white background, it triggers an evolutionary response. Your eye darts to it immediately. That targeted red illuminates the bleeding edges and the sudden vulnerabilities of the island's economy.
If this presentation were a physical room, it would be a stark white operating theater, where only the most vital organs of the economy are illuminated by a harsh red surgical light.
That's a great way to put it.
And the brief even mandates the layout. Every single slide must be formatted as 1/3 minimalist text, either on the left or the top, and 2/3 dense, high-information visualization. you are forced into an immediate confrontation with the data.
And that confrontation starts right away on slide 1, the cover page.
Yeah, the cover page is basically just a title, Curaçao Macroeconomic and Social Development In-Depth Assessment Report. And the subtitle notes it's based on structural transformation, population dynamics, and sustainability.
With just a few very minimal linear icons, like geometric lines representing the economy, energy, and population.
And a little note at the bottom saying it's based on deep insights from the World Bank and macro databases.
Yeah.
That's so serious.
It is. And then slide 2, the executive summary hits you. It's brilliantly structured as a 4-quadrant grid. It doesn't ease you in at all. It drops 4 staggering metrics on the viewer to anchor the entire narrative.
Let's lay those 4 metrics out for the listener. First quadrant, economic resilience. Services constitute an overwhelming 77% of the island's GDP.
Highly dependent on tourism, very vulnerable to external shocks.
Right. Second quadrant, the energy transition. Renewable energy has hit a historic 29% of their power grid. And the brief says to explicitly draw a circle around that 29%.
A huge milestone.
Third quadrant, demographics.
Yeah.
16.7% of the population is now over the age of 65. The aging is accelerating.
Yep.
And fourth, the social challenge. We're looking at terrifyingly high youth unemployment and a massive gender divide in education.
Those 4 quadrants aren't just arbitrary bullet points. They represent the 4 foundational pillars of a micronation's survival strategy.
How so?
Well, you have the economic engine, which is services. You have the physical infrastructure, which is energy. You have the biological reality, which is demographic aging. And you have the future potential, which is the youth labor market. By placing them in a grid, the designer establishes the inescapable interconnectedness of the ecosystem.
Meaning, if one changes, they all change.
Exactly. You cannot alter one of these quadrants without sending immediate violent shockwaves through the other 3.
Which brings us to the first real shockwave in the data. Slide 3 of the brief focuses on demographics, specifically this unstoppable demographic shift. Now, every economic story fundamentally begins with the human beings participating in it.
Right, the labor force.
And the foundation of Curaçao's story right now is that the population is just stagnating and getting older.
The demographic data is the slow-moving tectonic plate beneath this entire economy. According to the data sources in the brief, Curaçao's total population has been relatively stagnant for decades, fluctuating within a narrow band between 140,000 and 160,000 people.
So it's not growing like a typical developing nation.
Not at all. It is not experiencing robust natural population growth.
Stagnant total numbers, yes, but the internal composition of who actually makes up that 150,000 is radically changing. The brief highlights that the demographic of people aged 65 and older has climbed relentlessly.
It really has.
Back in 1990, the elderly made up just 4.2% of the population. In recent years, that number has surged to 16.7%.
That is nearly a 4-fold increase.
A 4-fold increase, and the visual instructions here are incredibly specific. The designer is mandated to use a dual-axis area line chart. The main axis is the total population trend, and the secondary axis is that 65+ percentage.
And they have to use an upward arrow to emphasize that almost 4-fold jump.
Right, and they are explicitly instructed to draw a dashed red circle around the steep upward slope of the aging curve between 2015 and 2020.
That dashed red circle is arguably the most critical warning light in the entire presentation.
Why that specific 5-year window?
Because that's when the acceleration really dates. When you have a stagnant total population, meaning you aren't adding a massive new generation of youth, nor are you experiencing massive influxes of working-age immigrants, and simultaneously your elderly population quadruples, you undergo a severe macroeconomic shock to your dependency ratio.
Let's pause and break down the dependency ratio for the listener, because it's a term economists throw around, but the literal mechanics of it are crucial to understand here.
Mechanically, the dependency ratio is the mathematical relationship between the people who are actively working in the formal economy, paying income taxes, producing goods, providing services.
People pulling the cart.
Exactly. Versus the people who are biologically or legally dependent, which usually means children under 15 and adults over 65. In a healthy, growing economy, you might have 3 or 4 working adults for everyone dependent.
Okay, so the burden is shared.
Right. The tax burden to build schools and fund pensions is spread out widely. But when that ratio shifts heavily toward the elderly in a stagnant population, the economic weight on the working age population skyrockets. A shrinking pool of workers has to generate the tax revenue to support increasingly expensive healthcare infrastructure, specialized elderly care, and state pension systems.
If you were listening to this in a major metropolitan area, like, say, London or New York, an aging population might just look like slightly higher municipal taxes or maybe longer wait times at the local clinic.
Because cities have a buffer.
Yeah, they constantly pull in young immigrants from other regions to fill the labor gaps. But imagine if your city was completely isolated by an ocean and you couldn't easily bus in temporary labor. It's almost like a massive cruise ship
Yeah.
where a huge chunk of the crew all decides to retire on the exact same day.
But they don't leave the ship.
Exactly. The ship is still floating, the passengers still need to be fed, the rooms need to be cleaned, but who is left to actually steer the vessel and shovel coal into the engine room?
The cruise ship analogy is highly mechanically accurate. In a massive nation like Japan, which is famous for its aging population, the crisis is a slow, grinding issue that plays out over decades. Japan cushions that blow with massive industrial automation robots building cars and deep sovereign wealth.
But on an island of 150,000 people.
The labor pool is incredibly shallow to begin with. When 16.7% of your population ages out of the workforce, you don't just lose abstract labor statistics, you lose specific institutional memory.
Like who?
You lose your master electricians, your experienced hospital administrators, your senior teachers. And because an island microeconomy lacks the scale to heavily automate its primary industries, I mean, you can't automate a bartender or a hotel concierge, the physical absence of working-age bodies is felt immediately in the everyday functioning of the economy.
Which leads perfectly into slide 5, industrial structure. What exactly are those remaining working-age bodies doing? With a shrinking pool of workers, how is this island actually generating the wealth required to keep the lights on and the pensions funded?
And the data reveals an economic model that is almost unnerving in its lack of diversification.
Unnerving is the right word. The dominance of the service sector is absolute. Services account for anywhere from 70% to a staggering 77.9% of the total gross domestic product.
And the designer is specifically instructed to highlight that 77.9% block on a stacked horizontal bar chart, or maybe a ring chart.
Right, to visualize what the brief calls typical island service economy traits. Meanwhile, industry as a whole, which includes construction, sits at just 11 to 17%.
And actual manufacturing, the literal making of physical goods, is practically non-existent. It floats between a mere 2.5% and 9.2%.
This introduces a critical concept known as economic concentration risk, right?
Yes. When nearly 80% of your entire national output relies on the service sector, and a massive portion of that is specifically in-person tourism, you are effectively running a monocrop economy.
A monocrop economy, like relying entirely on bananas.
Exactly. You are entirely existentially dependent on the willingness and the financial ability of the outside world to purchase an airplane ticket and physically travel to your island.
And for a long time, the outside world definitely came. Slide 6 focuses on this core engine, tourism. The data shows that at its peak, Curacao saw over 1.29 million international arrivals in a single year.
Think about that ratio.
I know. To put that physical volume into perspective for the listener, that is roughly 8 times the entire population of the island arriving and departing every single year. At that peak, tourism receipts accounted for over 36% of all their exports. They were riding an incredible high.
But then, slide 4 and 6 mandate visual representations of a car hitting a brick wall at 80 miles an hour.
The 2020 global health crisis.
Right. On slide 4, the designer is told to create a bar chart with a strict baseline of 0 to show annual GDP growth. For years, the bars are bobbing comfortably above the line. But in 2020, there is a cliff edge drop.
The brief requires a thick red circle around the negative growth bar, which plunged to negative 11.4%. And it asks for a little text box explaining that it's a structural shutdown triggered by a global public health event.
And back on slide 6, showing the tourism data with a dual-axis line chart, there has to be a downward arrow marking the violent crash of tourism receipts from over 36% down to 27.7%.
Now, to be fair to the data, they did experience a rebound. On slide 4, it shows a growth of 4.1% in 2021 and 6.9% in 2022. And the brief asks for green upward arrows there to show the recovery.
True, but that initial structural shock is the absolute focal point. And we need to linger on the mechanics of that shock because it raises a fundamental question about the architecture of a service monopoly.
What happens when the tourists literally aren't allowed to fly?
Exactly. When a global shock hits, whether it's a pandemic shutting down international airspace or a severe global recession wiping out the disposable income that middle-class families use for Caribbean vacations, the impact on Curaçao is not just a minor dip in corporate quarterly profits, it triggers absolute structural paralysis.
You use the phrase structural paralysis. For someone who isn't a macroeconomist, what does that actually look like on the ground? What is the physical mechanism of that paralysis when the tourists stop coming?
It comes down to the velocity of money.
Okay, velocity of money.
In a diversified economy, if the tourism sector takes a hit, money is still circulating. The tech sector is still paying software engineers. The agricultural sector is still selling wheat. The manufacturing sector is still exporting car parts. Money moves from the factory worker to the local grocery store to the local plumber. That is the velocity of money.
So the economy keeps humming, just a bit slower.
Right. But in a microeconomy where nearly 80% of GDP is services, the tourist's wallet is the primary source of that velocity. Think of a $50 bill a tourist hands to a taxi driver at the airport.
Okay.
That taxi driver uses the $50 to buy lunch at a local cafe. The cafe owner uses it to pay the local farmer for vegetables. When the planes stop landing, that initial $50 injection vanishes entirely.
The whole chain snaps.
Exactly. The hotels empty out, the restaurants close, the taxi drivers sit idle. Because there is no manufacturing base or massive agricultural sector to fall back on, the circulation of currency on the island simply halts.
So when people say an island economy needs to diversify, what does that actually mean in reality? Because it feels like if you tell a tiny Caribbean island to diversify, the immediate assumption is, okay, let's build a massive car manufacturing plant. But they physically can't do that, right?
No, of course not.
They don't have the land mass, they don't have a cheap labor pool of millions, and they aren't connected by rail to mainland supply chains. They can't compete with Mexico or Vietnam in physical manufacturing. Are they just geographically locked into this tourism trap forever?
That is the existential puzzle for almost every microstate. You are absolutely right that traditional industrial diversification is physically impossible. When economists advise an island to diversify, they don't mean building steel mills, they mean diversifying within the service sector.
Digital services.
Yes, they must find ways to export high-value services that do not require the consumer to physically step off a cruise ship. We are talking about international finance, remote tech support, digital data hosting, or specialized consulting.
Which leads us directly into a massive paradox outlined in slide 7 of the brief. Because Curaçao produces so few physical goods, with manufacturing under 10%, they have to import virtually everything.
Everything.
They have to import the vehicles the taxis drive, the industrial air conditioning units for the resorts, the specialized building materials, the fuel, the clothes, and a vast majority of the food required to sustain not just their 150,000 citizens, but those 1.29 million tourists. Everything has to arrive on a cargo ship or a plane.
And that unavoidable physical reality manifests in the macroeconomic data as a colossal structural trade deficit. The brief dictates a very specific visual for slide 7, a symmetrical bar chart.
Right, exports pointing up the center line and imports pointing down with a net balance line cutting through the middle.
And the designer is instructed to explicitly shade the negative net balance area in a neutral gray, visually emphasizing a gaping structural hole in the economy. We are looking at a persistent trade deficit ranging anywhere from $650 million to $1.4 billion annually.
$1 billion deficit for an island that small.
Yes. The monetary value of the physical things they must import severely, massively outweighs the physical things they export. And the slide asks for an arrow pointing to the net outflow, with a note saying the structural deficit has to be made up by tourism revenue and foreign capital.
I'll try a different analogy here. I've heard trade deficits described as a leaky bucket, but that doesn't quite capture the scale of this. It's less like a traditional country and more like a massive, highly sophisticated theme park.
A theme park. Okay, I like that.
Think about it. A theme park doesn't manufacture its own roller coasters, it doesn't drill for its own electricity, and it doesn't grow the wheat for its own hot dog stands. It imports all of that massive physical overhead at a huge cost. So on paper, the theme park operates at a massive physical deficit. But it survives, and even thrives, because it charges a premium admission fee for the experience. Is that how we should view Curaçao's trade deficit, just the overhead cost of running the island?
That is a brilliant mechanical analogy. Yes, this is the textbook definition of an open island economy. A multi-million-dollar trade deficit in physical goods isn't necessarily a failure of domestic policy. It is the fundamental feature of their economic model. They import physical goods so that they can export experiences.
Experiences being the tourism.
Right. When a tourist pays for a week at a resort, that counts as service export, and that brings foreign capital into the country to plug the hole created by importing the food and the fuel. However, tourism revenue alone is rarely enough to plug a billion-dollar hole. The theme park also needs investors constantly building new rides.
And that brings us to slide 13, foreign direct investment, or FDI.
The lifeblood of development.
The data on FDI is wild. The slide requires a bar chart with a long-term trend line. It shows that capital inflows are highly volatile. They swing from negative numbers, which means capital flight, money actively fleeing the island, all the way up to massive pulses of 6.7% of their total GDP.
And the brief asks to highlight any year where FDI is above 5%, with a call-out explaining that these are driven by large-scale investment projects.
But what triggers a massive pulse of foreign investment? Why would a multinational corporation pour millions of dollars into a tiny island with a massive trade deficit and an aging workforce?
This is where we have to look past the beaches and look at the invisible infrastructure of the island. On slide 14, the presentation mandates a look at institutional quality. It asks for a radar chart or a horizontal band chart highlighting the World Governance Indicators, or WGI.
Ah, right.
The data proves that Curaçao boasts a highly stable rule of law and strong anti-corruption measures. The brief wants the designer to use a gray background to contrast Curaçao's metrics against the broader Caribbean average, showing they significantly outperform their neighbors.
Okay, so they have good laws.
If we extrapolate the mechanics of this data, institutional stability is arguably the island's single most valuable unwritten export.
Wait, let me push back on that phrasing. How is rule of law an export? It's an internal legal framework. You can't put a court system on a cargo ship and sell it to Europe.
You don't export it physically, no. You sell access to it. Institutional stability is a rare commodity that global capital desperately seeks. If you are a multinational hotel conglomerate or a foreign infrastructure developer looking to build a $50 million wind farm, you aren't just looking at average wind speeds or ocean views.
You're looking at the risk.
You are looking at the local court system. If a local contractor breaches an agreement, will the courts uphold the contract impartially? Is the central bank stable, or will they arbitrarily devalue the currency and wipe out your profits? Are property rights clearly defined and strictly enforceable?
And Curaçao has that.
Largely due to its historical and constitutional ties to the Netherlands, yes. Curaçao offers European-style institutional security in a Caribbean geography. That legal certainty is the invisible glue. It is the absolute prerequisite for attracting those volatile FDI pulses that keep the economic theme park running.
That reframes things completely. The foreign investor isn't just buying a piece of beachfront real estate. They are buying the legal certainty that the property won't be expropriated by a volatile government in 5 years.
Precisely.
If that's true, how crucial is that rule of law metric? What happens if it slips?
It is life or death for the macroeconomy. The moment global capital perceives a breakdown in the rule of law or a spike in local corruption, the FDI doesn't just slow down, it violently reverses. You get the capital flight we saw in the data. The trade deficit hole remains, but the investor water stops pouring in.
And they still have to buy food and fuel.
Right. Foreign exchange reserves plummet, and the island can literally lose the hard currency required to purchase imported food and fuel on the global market.
Speaking of fuel, let's look at how they are trying to fix that exact vulnerability.
Yes.
Slide 8 of the design brief shifts the visual tone dramatically. We move from the anxiety of the trade deficit to a narrative of aggressive, almost triumphant transformation. It tackles the most painful part of their import dependency.
Historically, the greatest Achilles heel of any island economy is energy generation. If you have to import all your fuel, you are at the absolute mercy of global commodity markets.
And the brief requires a percentage stack area chart here, showing the relationship between oil and renewables over time.
Right. And the data shows that for a long time, Curaçao relied 100% on imported oil to generate its electricity. Every time a geopolitical crisis caused the price of a barrel of crude oil to spike globally, the island bled capital just to keep the air conditioning running in the tourist resorts and the lights on in the hospitals.
But the data reveals a massive pivot. That 100% reliance on imported oil has dropped to between 70.7% and 83%. Why? Because non-hydro renewable energy, specifically wind and solar power, has skyrocketed from practically nothing, under 1%, to an incredible 29% of the total energy grid.
It's an incredible achievement.
And the design brief is fiercely proud of this number. It specifically asks the designer to draw a magnifying glass graphic right at the exact point on the chart where renewable energy crosses that 29% peak, with the note calling it an important milestone in decarbonizing the energy mix.
You called this macroeconomic sovereignty earlier.
Yeah, that sounds like a great political buzzword, but practically, what does sovereignty mean for an island that still has to import its food?
It means controlling the baseline cost of your own existence. Hitting 29% non-hydro renewable penetration is a staggering engineering and economic milestone. There are massive, incredibly wealthy nations that have spent billions of dollars in decades trying to hit that proportion of green energy and are still struggling with grid integration.
So for Curacao, it's huge.
For an island, this isn't just an environmental victory or a talking point about climate change. Every single megawatt of electricity generated by the Caribbean wind is a megawatt they do not have to buy from foreign oil cartels. It directly shrinks that massive billion-dollar trade deficit we just talked about. It keeps that capital inside the local economy.
Hold on, though. Building state-of-the-art wind farms requires massive upfront capital. We're talking millions of dollars in imported turbines and specialized engineering. If they have a massive trade deficit and an aging tax base, how is a microeconomy affording European-level green infrastructure in the first place? Aren't they just trading long-term oil debt for immediate infrastructure debt?
That is the exact tension of the transition. Yes, the initial capital expenditure is massive, and it usually requires leveraging that strong institutional framework we discussed, that rule of law to secure favorable international financing or foreign direct investment. But the math works out over the long term because the fuel, the wind, and the sun is free forever.
Let's talk about the physical reality of a microgrid. Does being geographically isolated actually make it easier to completely rewire a society for the future? Replacing the power infrastructure of an island of 150,000 people seems like a much more contained project than, say, trying to rewire the entire eastern seaboard of the United States.
It's a fascinating double-edged sword. On one hand, yes, there is an incredible agility to microgrids. The scale of capital expenditure required to build a few state-of-the-art wind farms on the rugged north coast of the island is manageable, and the impact on the overall grid percentage is immediate and massive.
Right, a few turbines go a long way.
Exactly. You don't have to navigate the jurisdictional nightmares of crossing state lines, and you don't suffer the vast transmission losses of moving power across thousands of miles. But the flip side is grid stability, and this is where it gets incredibly precarious.
Why precarious?
Because a massive continental grid acts like a giant shock absorber. If the wind suddenly drops in Texas, they can pull excess power from Oklahoma or Louisiana. A microgrid doesn't have a neighboring state it can instantly borrow gigawatts of power from.
Oh, wow. I didn't think of that.
Yeah, if a dense cloud cover rolls over the solar farms or the wind drops suddenly, the grid frequency can collapse in seconds. Managing 29% intermittent renewables on an isolated island requires incredibly sophisticated battery storage and dynamic grid management software. It is a high-wire act of electrical engineering. But clearly, the data shows they are managing it successfully.
And it's not just the electrical grid they are rewiring. Slide 9 pivots from physical power to digital infrastructure. And the visual instructions here are super specific. It asks for a step-line chart to visualize the growth in connectivity.
A step-line chart, yes.
Now, we see internet penetration exceeding 68% of the population. Fixed broadband subscriptions grew from 20 to almost 33 users per 100 people. The brief asks for a trend arrow there, but the metric that absolutely jumps off the page is the number of secure internet servers.
It's an unbelievable jump.
It experienced an explosive exponential leap from just 13 servers per million people to 5,071 servers per million. And the brief demands a red circle around this exponential growth.
The designer was brilliant to mandate a step-line chart for this, rather than a smooth curve, because a step-line chart perfectly visualizes how digital infrastructure works in the physical world.
Explain that. Why does a step-line chart matter?
Because digital capacity doesn't grow in a smooth biological slope like population aging. You don't slowly add 1 megabyte of bandwidth a day. You charter a massive, specialized ship. You lay a multi-million-dollar fiber optic submarine cable on the ocean floor, physically connecting the island to the global digital backbone. You plug it into a newly built server farm, and in one single day, the capacity of the island steps up instantly. It's binary. You go from a constrained, localized network to a high-speed global reality overnight. That is what the horizontal line, followed by a sudden vertical jump, represents on the chart.
And leaping from 13 secure servers to over 5,000 implies a massive strategic intent. They aren't just giving locals the ability to stream 4K movies faster. You don't need 5,000 secure servers for Netflix.
No, you don't.
They're building the physical architecture required for highly secure global finance, corporate data hosting, and digital services. They're actively trying to build the new economic engine we talked about earlier.
Exactly. This connects directly back to our discussion on how an island diversifies. If you want to export services without requiring tourists to fly to your island, you need flawless, highly secure, low-latency digital infrastructure. You cannot host international banking or global e-commerce or support thousands of remote tech workers on an unreliable, slow connection. That explosion in secure servers is the island laying down the concrete foundation for a digital service economy. They are trying to future-proof the nation.
So they lay this massive submarine cable, they plug in 5,000 servers, they build the wind farms. The physical hardware of the island is modernizing at breakneck speed. But here is the intensely uncomfortable question. Who is actually sitting at the keyboards? Who is maintaining the turbines?
That is the real bottleneck.
Because when you look at the human capital data starting on slide 10, the system fractures. The data reveals a very dark underlying truth about the workforce, and the design brief demands it be highlighted with extreme care.
We have to start this section by acknowledging the high baseline, which again speaks to the institutional quality of the island we discussed earlier. Slide 10 mandates a KPI dashboard showing excellent fundamental human development.
Right.
The total population's life expectancy is remarkably stable at around 76.8 years, with women regularly living past 80. And the slide asks for full progress bar icons to show that the population has 100% access to basic drinking water and basic sanitation.
100%.
In many parts of the developing world, hitting 100% clean water and a near 80-year life expectancy is the ultimate multi-generational goal. For Curaçao, those are merely the baseline operating conditions. The slide even adds a note, a solid foundation for human development.
Right. They have entirely conquered the physical necessities of human survival. But when we move to slide 11, looking at the education and labor data, the social fabric starts to tear. The brief requires what is called a butterfly chart for the education slide.
A very specific visual choice.
Yeah, if you've never seen one, picture two horizontal bar charts placed back to back, sharing a center vertical axis. The left side is for men, the right side is for women. Now, in primary education elementary school, the wings of the butterfly are perfectly symmetrical. It shows universal enrollment and total gender equality.
But higher education is a different story.
Exactly. When the chart moves up to higher education, to tertiary enrollment, a massive structural scissor gap opens up.
The numbers here are profoundly concerning for the future of the labor market, especially a labor market trying to pivot to digital services. Female tertiary enrollment sits at a robust 32.4%. But male tertiary enrollment is an abysmal 13.7%.
That's less than half.
That is an 18.7 percentage point chasm. And the brief mandates that the designer use a connecting line between the two ends of the bars to visually emphasize just how glaring and structural this gap is, with an asterisk on the women's side noting that their human capital accumulation is significantly dominant.
Let's debate the sociological why behind this, because it's fascinating and honestly devastating. Why is this massive gender gap happening? Do local young men just drop out of school at 18 to take immediate cash jobs in the informal tourism sector?
It's very likely.
I imagine if you're an 18-year-old guy, the prospect of driving a dive boat or bartending for immediate cash tips from tourists seems much more appealing than grinding through 4 years of a university degree. But fast forward 10 years, the women who stayed in school are managing the digital economy, running the banks, and administering the government, while the men are structurally stuck in a volatile, informal sector.
You've likely identified the exact socioeconomic mechanism. The immediate lure of the informal, cash-based tourism economy is incredibly strong for young men. It provides instant income and social status. However, that income is heavily dependent on physical youth and a booming tourism market.
Which we know can vanish overnight.
Exactly. It lacks long-term stability, pension benefits, or career progression. The delayed gratification of tertiary education is much harder to sell when the cruise ships are docked and the cash is flowing. But the consequence of that choice is a catastrophic skills mismatch a decade later.
And that educational mismatch spills directly into slide 12, a severe crisis in the labor market. The brief asks for a line and scatter combo chart. The youth unemployment data, specifically looking at 15 to 24-year-olds, is absolutely terrifying.
It really is.
It fluctuates wildly depending on the year, but it has hit peaks of 37.1% and even an unbelievable 42.2%. The designer is instructed to draw a bold, thick red circle around that 42.2% peak and add a note saying, warning signal of wasted human capital.
Let's synthesize what the socioeconomic paradox actually means on the streets. You have an economy with a massive demand for services. You have an economy desperately trying to pivot to high-tech digital and green infrastructure. And yet, at times, nearly half of your youth are sitting completely idle.
How is that even mathematically possible?
It points to a severe structural mismatch. The skills that the youth are acquiring, or more accurately, failing to acquire by dropping out of higher education, do not match the skills the modernizing economy is demanding. The new server farms don't need boat drivers. They need network engineers.
I'm trying to wrap my head around a 42.2% youth unemployment rate.
Yeah.
What does that physically look like in a society? What happens to the social fabric of a nation when nearly half of the young people, particularly young men who have abandoned college, simply cannot plug into the formal economy?
The sociological impacts are deeply destabilizing. When young men are structurally excluded from higher education and the formal labor market, you see an immediate rise in the informal autonomy and, inevitably, a strain on social safety nets and law enforcement.
It breeds resentment, I imagine.
Of course. But more insidiously, it creates a profound sociological imbalance. Over a generation, this impacts family formation, social cohesion, and political stability. The red circle around the 42.2% unemployment rate isn't just a macroeconomic warning light. It is a klaxon sounding for the future of the social contract on the island. You cannot build a stable digital future if half your youth feel they have no stake in it.
Which brings us to the finale of the presentation. Slide 15. Conclusions and strategic implications. This presentation wasn't commissioned just to walk a board of directors or government policymakers through a list of depressing statistics. It is designed to synthesize all this stark, high-contrast data into an actionable roadmap. The final slide is an infographic, 3 distinct columns outlining the strategic imperatives for the survival and prosperity of Curaçao, with a dark blue banner at the bottom saying, "Towards a sustainable and inclusive future."
The brilliance of the design brief is how it forces the conclusion to emerge naturally from the interconnected data we just walked through. Column 1 is economic diversification and resilience.
Right.
The imperative is to utilize that explosive growth in digital infrastructure, those 5,000 secure servers, to pivot away from a purely physical tourism model. They need to actively trade in digital services. This builds a buffer, a resilience against the next pandemic or global travel shock.
Column 2 is deepening the green energy transition. They have to protect and aggressively expand that 29% renewable energy milestone.
Oh.
The goal isn't just environmental. It's to completely kill their reliance on imported fossil fuels. If they can produce 100% of their power from the wind and the sun, they structurally erase a massive portion of their trade deficit and permanently stop the bleeding of capital to foreign oil markets.
And column 3 is perhaps the hardest because it deals with human psychology, not just wires and wind turbines, repairing the labor market fault lines.
It's a youth crisis.
Yes. You cannot build a digital, diversified economy without fixing the human capital crisis. The strategy demands entirely reimagined vocational and skills training programs directly targeted at that 40+% youth unemployment block. They must specifically address why young men are abandoning education and bridge the gap between the informal tourism economy and the formal digital economy.
Everything is fundamentally interconnected. You can't fix the multi-billion-dollar trade deficit without exporting digital services. You can't build a digital service economy without fixing the educational gender gap and the labor mismatch. And you can't run the server farms affordably without the green energy microgrid.
It all ties together.
The strict, stark design of this presentation, the pure white FFFFFFF background, the unyielding navy blue structure, the precise targeted drops of warning red, it leaves the viewer with absolutely nowhere to look but the truth. It strips away the comforting illusions of the tourist brochure and forces policymakers to face these interconnected realities head-on without distraction.
The minimalism of the presentation is the message itself. By removing the noise and the decorative buffer, the data speaks with an urgency and clarity that political rhetoric simply cannot match.
So let's step back from the design brief and look at the whole picture we've uncovered today. We started with a rigid set of visual constraints, white, navy, red, and we uncovered the incredibly rich, vulnerable, and deeply human story of an island nation navigating a treacherous transition.
A really remarkable journey.
We saw a rapidly aging population putting crushing pressure on a tiny, isolated labor force. We saw the terrifying fragility of an economy relying on 1.2 million tourists to keep the money circulating. We saw the invisible strength of stable governance keeping foreign investment flowing to plug a structural trade deficit. We marveled at the aggressive rewiring of their energy and digital grids, and we confronted the dark sociological reality of a 42% youth unemployment rate and a massive educational gender gap.
It is, in every sense, a microcosm of the 21st century global economy, distilled and magnified onto a 171 square mile island.
It really is. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over. As we look at the data from Curaçao, we see a nation that has successfully secured the absolute baseline of human necessities. They have 100% access to clean drinking water and sanitation. They boast an incredible life expectancy approaching 80 years. They have stable institutions and the rule of law.
The fundamentals are there.
By the traditional metrics of the 20th century, they have unequivocally won the global development game. And yet, simultaneously, they are suffering from massive youth disillusionment, educational fracturing, and a peak 40+% unemployment rate among the young.
It forces a profound reevaluation of what we consider development to actually mean.
Exactly. Does this data suggest that for modern, advanced microeconomies, surviving is no longer the primary problem? That the true crisis of the 21st century isn't finding clean water or avoiding starvation, but finding purpose and economic integration in a highly specialized, hyper-vulnerable, globalized world?
That's the real question.
As you look at the economies around you, whether you live on a small island, a rural town, or in a massive metropolis, ask yourself, are our metrics for success actually keeping up with the reality of the human challenges we face?
That is the real power of rigorous data. It answers the questions we know to ask, but more importantly, it forces us to ask entirely new ones.
Something to think about the next time you look at a simple red circle on a chart.